Hello, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Adam Golov, Marketing Communications Manager at Data Conversion Laboratory, and I'll be your moderator today. Before we get started, I wanted to let you know we will allow time at the end of the webinar for questions and answers. So please write your questions in the chat area as they come to mind. If we don't have time to answer them all, we'll make them available on our website. Next slide, please. For those of you who are not familiar with DCL, we convert and organize content to create electronic documents, populate databases, publish on the web, and basically get it ready for tomorrow's technology. Next slide, please. DCL services help you refine your document conversion strategy, identify document redundancy, extract metadata, and transform legacy and future documents for real needs, today and in the future. Next slide, please. DCL serves a very broad client base. Next slide, please. Spanning all industries. Next slide, please. Today, we are thrilled to introduce Mike Gross. As DCL's Chief Technology Officer, Mike is responsible for solution engineering. Mike has been solving digital publishing conversion problems at DCL for over 30 years, where he has overseen thousands of legacy conversion projects. Mike is also the chief architect of DCL's document conversion toolset, including its proprietary hub-and-spoke technology and its Harmonizer content reuse analysis tool. Prior to joining DCL in 1986, Mike managed the development of a U.S. Air Force software development toolset for Advanced Computer Techniques Corporation. He holds a BS in Computer Engineering from the Case Institute of Technology at Case Western Reserve University. Without further ado, welcome Mike.
Okay, thank you, Adam, and I want to welcome everybody to today's webinar. As hopefully you know, the topic today is content reuse and how we can try to be smarter about it. Let me just begin by saying that at DCL we've been dealing with document conversions to structured markup languages, which hopefully many of you are familiar with, such as XML and its predecessor SGML for almost 30 years, probably 20-some-odd years, and even before, I can recall that even before XML was around, when its predecessor SGML was around in the late 90s, one of the main features that people talked about taking your documents into a structured markup language like SGML or like XML is content reuse, and that certainly is one of the benefits of moving your documents into such a technology. But I have seen over the years that it really isn't such an easy thing to implement. Doing it takes work and takes planning, and the belief is that that if you can find some tools that help you get there, there's certainly a big benefit for yourself. So let's start talking about content reuse, what it is, and what we can do about it. Some of the questions we're going to discuss for a few minutes are, first of all, what do we mean by content reuse? Why is it important? Who benefits from it? Some challenges that my own personal observations that I've seen over the years from companies trying to implement reuse. What kinds of scenarios can I expect to find reuse in my documentation? I'll show you some statistics on that. Maybe some rules about when you should consider doing a reuse analysis. And let's begin with what we mean by content reuse. So let's start with a definition from Anne Rockley, a documentation guru and a guru in the field of content reuse. Content reuse is the practice of using existing content components to develop new documents. What I mean by that is taking documentation that already exists and using pieces of it to produce new documentation. If you've got documents that live in Word, Microsoft Word, or some other publishing format, and you're writing a new document and grabbing text from one document to another, well, at some level you are already some sort of level of content reuse, not rewriting the documentation. Obviously, companies have many types of documents that often have commonality between document sets. So there's already some level of document reuse. If you're using Some of the publishing packages, one that comes to mind is Adobe FrameMaker has a significant support for conditional processing, so that you can have slight variants of your documentation, but keep the main part of the documentation the same. Those documents are those kind of environments really support reuse in a non-structured markup type of environment. So you may already be implementing some of that stuff in your own environment, even if it's not an XML publishing environment. Typically, reuse is done at a section or a paragraph level. You grab a piece of a document and say, I'm going to use that in a whole bunch of different manuals, or even at a paragraph level, but you certainly can do it at a sentence or at a phrase level as well. Obviously, doing it at a phrase level is harder because there's lots of phrases that get reused. Sometimes not necessarily doing reuse on a phrase level, but you're trying to just pull information out so that you can have some variations on a phrase that are used in different situations. Mentioned earlier about structured markups and the benefits of going to SGML and many of you may not even have heard of SGML because it really morphed into XML many years ago. But there are still companies that are doing SGML publishing, and it's just a more complex version of SGML for those of you who have never seen it. But in the current state of affairs, certain XML architectures that are sort of off-the-shelf architectures that people use to produce documentation have some mechanisms built in that are useful for reuse. When we say useful for reuse, it means it allows you to, we talked about some of the conditional processing, allows you to have pretty much the same text in a few different scenarios and just replace some pieces of the text. Once you do that, you can boil your documentation down instead of having lots of different variations on it. The two of those are DITA and S1000D. DITA is a very popular XML markup environment that's very popular in the technical documentation world, and features the ability to break document sets into what are normally called topics. But beyond that, there's several different mechanisms. We're not going to go into them in detail today, but mechanisms that allow you to pull pieces of text from one part of a document into another. Just breaking whole documents into sections at some levels encourages reuse. S1000D is at some level similar to DITA in that it generally allows you to break documents down into they call modules as opposed to necessarily, but also has some mechanisms to do that kind of stuff. I just wanted to take a quick second to show you what we mean by the mechanisms to help. There's just a couple of examples in DITA of how you can do something to enhance reuse. In this particular top example, there are really two examples here. In this top example, you see I have a paragraph that says to find all, and then there's a variable here that you can fill in the name of a company. You may have a few different corporate names that are used depending on the particular nature of what the manuals you're producing. So let's say I wanted to make that a variable, but the rest of the text is the same. It allows you to do something like this, where you see right down below in this key def tag here, I define the name of a company. In this particular case, it's a company, a fictional company called GlobalCom. I can set that up. DITA allows you to have something called the DITA map, where you configure the way you publish your document. If I specify in a DITA map the company name is GlobalCom, then this paragraph up here will come out and say to find all GlobalCom partner solutions, call our global partner solution hotline. And by doing this, you encourage reuse, because the rest of the text, although this isn't a particular paragraph, you're encouraging reuse of this particular paragraph. Another construct that's useful is conditional text, which is just an example here. It has a paragraph where trying to tell people where to go for more information on this database items, the calculations document, or the management system and administration document. That's for the print version, because in a print version, you're going to be sending somebody to other print versions of manuals. But in a help version of manuals, and one of the things that's that's extremely useful for going to a structured markup language like XML is certainly repurposing documents. So you may have your documents living in several different environments. They may live in print, they may live in a help system, they may live online just on a web page or a version for tablets and mobile devices and that sort of thing. So this help-only version of this paragraph is different, but it allows you to specify that. So this says, go to this section of the help manual. These things all help reuse as much as possible because I can keep the rest of the document together and just have variations for the things that differ depending on the print version or the online version. Okay, just a quick slide talking about a mechanism in S1000D. So here you can see S1000D allows you to define conditions. I can say defining a condition that's a yes or no condition. And then I can define a specific condition called icy. Specify whether, I'm going to say whether this is for an icy situation or not. Once I set up saying whether a particular document is for an icy condition or not, set up on the left here is an example of this. I can pull in the applicability from these conditions I set up and specify, in this case, that the icy condition is yes, and then this applic one, this is an applicability tag, which is say when it actually, in which cases this text should really occur. And then down below, I'm just very simply having a paragraph that says de-icy aircraft, and it's only going to come out in a condition where I set it all up to say that it's an icy condition. Okay, and this is somewhat similar to stuff that we've seen mentioned earlier about SGML, one of the original founding technologies that SGML markup was based on, was the U.S. military technology called CALS, C-A-L-S, which all the U.S. military documents were being poured into, and those particular markup standards had a set called effectivity, where in any point in the document you could put a tag around a piece of text and say whether that only applies in a particular situation. Now, that was very flexible. It allowed you to essentially have lots of variations in your text without much pain. But just some examples, you may want to set up your own markups schema or DTD, in which case you can set up to take advantage of those sorts of things yourself. Okay. Question: why is content reuse important? Some of these things may be obvious, but we're going to mention them anyway. Increased consistency and language precision. When you do content reuse and you find that there's variation in your documentation, one of the things that often happens over time is corporations have one flavor of documentation. Over the years, they build more products and pull the documentation from one place to another. Something even as simple as cut and paste, and the documents diverge over time, and you end up with variations in your documentation sets. That's something that's happening naturally in a lot of environments when people aren't doing any sort of real content reuse. But if you start setting up to do content reuse, then the language that's used, you may have 7 different situations that are using essentially the same language, but they got modified differently over time or enhanced differently over time. And sometimes taking a look at the potential content reuse and cleaning it up will lead to increased consistency. We find situations very typically where the same thing is being said a few different ways. And the consistency and language precision is important when you're telling somebody how to perform a specific type of task in a technical environment. That can be quite useful. A push I know in the world of technical documentation for something called simplified technical English, so using very specific language. You may have over time started migrating towards that, and some of your versions might be using it and some not, or some versions may have been cleaned up and defined more precisely, and this allows you to do that sort of thing. Reduce development and maintenance costs is another benefit if you're implementing content reuse, and writing new manuals is quicker because you can pull things much more quickly from one environment to another. So maintenance costs when you have to maintain something. When let's say you have to change a paragraph that's being used essentially almost the same in 5 or 6 different environments. Well, I only have to go to one location and make the change theoretically. And that leads to the next one, which in my view is one of the most important items we're talking about here, which is reduced exposure to document errors. And the more versions of something that exist, the more potential is that if something has to change on it, that I'm not going to find every instance of it and fix it. And certainly if you're dealing with instructions on how to fly an aircraft or kind of the rules of when a pharmaceutical company that's giving you rules and contraindications of when to use or not to use a particular medication, if something changes over time and I don't find all occurrences of it, my risk can be fairly significant. And the costs of that sometimes are incalculable. So reducing the exposure to document errors, I think, is a great benefit. A reduced time frame to produce new documentation. We said it's going to cost you less because it's quicker to do, but also, one of the things that typically happens in a product development environment is the product may be ready, and the last thing that's holding it up to go out is the documentation to go along with it. And if you can reduce the time frame that it takes to produce that documentation, it can certainly get you your products to market more quickly, and that's always a benefit. And lastly, we talk about translation savings. Taking a look at content reuse and implementing it. We've been doing the reuse analysis we're going to be talking about in a couple minutes. Can help your translation savings simply because when you're doing translations to what they call localization, to localizing documents to different languages, you may be selling your product in many different countries and having different languages. The cost of translation can be quite high. And those things are typically done, let's say, on a sentence level. And if I have 5 different variants of the same sentence that are essentially saying the same thing, and I shrink them down to make them all consistent, then I may not have to pay for that sentence to be translated 5 times. I may be able to only have it translated 1 time. Okay, and then quickly, who benefits from content reuse? Well, your customers benefit because they'll have more consistent language. They certainly benefit too if there are no errors, if there are less potential errors in your documentation sets. The more consistent language means that it may be easier for them to understand what something is saying. And sometimes different versions of language can be a little bit vague. So they'll benefit. Your business will benefit, as we mentioned before, the faster time to market, the less exposure to the consequence of documentation errors, and your bottom line can benefit because there's more efficiency. It takes you less time and money to write your documentation, and it may take you less money to perform the translation and checking that it's correct and all that sort of thing. Challenges implementing reuse, and these are just my observations that I've seen over the years on some of the challenges where I mentioned earlier it's not always so easy to do. Different product groups may need to share reusable data and need to agree on changes. And what I'm talking about here is that you can have, let's say, 4 or 5 different products that have their own product groups and even their own product manuals, and they historically have had control over their manuals. If you find a piece of a manual that's being shared among groups and you decide that the language needs to be changed, or one group may decide it needs to be changed, you may need to get everybody to agree on the changes. And I've had people tell me, it's like too annoying. Previously I had, imagine a pharmaceutical company that has 6 versions of a particular product, maybe a drug of some sort, and they're just variations of capsules and caplets and different dosages, and the manuals for them exist in Microsoft Word, and there were just 6 versions of the manuals to go with 6 versions of the products. If one of those groups wants to change something, they can just go in and change it, but once it becomes set up in reusable pieces, it becomes harder to do, which isn't the reason not to do it. Just means that you've got to get people to agree, and that is somewhat of a challenge. one of the things I just wanted to mention was related to, finding errors in these sorts of things. I was once discussing content reuse and talking about content reuse analysis and how it can make things more efficient, and said, well, instead of making, if you find something has to change in 6 different versions, now you only have to change it in 1. And he commented to me, well, we now get paid by the government to make the change 6 different times. And these are some of the practicalities of what people deal with. And I would make the case that that's just wasted money. And if you save money for your clients, they're going to benefit, and ultimately you'll benefit. Everyone will be happier in a world where everybody's very cost conscious, and certainly making things more efficient most of the time is a good idea. But you can run into situations where it's not to somebody's benefit to make the change simply because they get paid for it, and you have to face those sorts of things. Last thing just to mention is that, and we're going to be talking about our reuse analysis service in a minute. When you do an analysis, you may find errors that were previously undiscovered, and we found those. We've done them over the years for a number of clients. And sometimes, like the person that's in charge of documentation group sees this and they gulp because they realize, well, it might make them look bad. And certainly there are cases where we've really done a sloppy job over the years. That sort of thing can happen, but again, I would argue that it's much better to know about the problems and fix them than it is to just sort of keep it under the rugs, sort of thing. Okay, so I mentioned before we're going to be talking about reuse analysis, and solution that brings some help to the table on this particular situation is we're going to be discussing what we call our harmonizer reuse analysis service. And let me just begin by explaining that at DCL we've been doing document conversions for many years, and this partially started with one of the companies that we was supposed to be doing a conversion for, and the company had told us they were going to be giving us a documentation to convert, and then we didn't see anything for several months. And we inquired what happened. They said, well, we had 25,000 pages of documentation, but you were going to charge us for converting those 25,000 pages per page, and we realized that much of our documentation was essentially redundant from other documentation, so we figured we'd shrink it all down. So essentially what they did was they did their own setup for content reuse. We asked them how they did it, and they just did it all manually, and it took a very long time to go through it and figure this stuff out. And we said, you know what, let's see if we can supply some sort of service that might help them do that sort of thing, and that's where Harmonizer emanated from. Okay, so how does this work? A client submits to us source documents, whole documentation set. You send the documentation set to us. We sign confidentiality agreements and that sort of thing if anybody's worried about that kind of thing. And then usually after a few days, you receive back a summary and detailed reuse analysis reports. And we're going to be spending a significant amount of time today discussing that. The source files typically can be in most desktop publishing format, either in desktop publishing formats such as mentioned before, Adobe Frame, certainly Adobe InDesign or Quark Express. Interleaf is an older format, not as popular anymore. Number of formats like that, or word processing. The most popular, obviously, is Microsoft Word of word processing formats. And lastly, structured file formats. What I mean by that is any HTML or XML or even HTML. So you can give us your documentation sets. We run an analysis on them, and then we give you back a report. Okay, so before we actually look at the summary report and the detailed report, just some definitions of what we're talking about in these reports. The way the reuse analysis service works is it goes through your documentation, reads, tries to find all the paragraphs within your documents, and the paragraphs generally are, desktop publishing environment or word processing environment, concept of paragraphs. Inside of structured markup, we may have to define which which tags define something at a paragraph level, and that's configurable. But anyway, so we're doing this lookup at a paragraph level, because that tends to be consistent across documentation sets. Okay, now, a couple terminologies that we use. The first version of a paragraph text is called the base paragraph. That means as we go down paragraphs, we're looking for paragraphs that contain a unique set of words that we haven't seen before. If we see a paragraph that doesn't appear to be an exact or a close match to other paragraphs that we've seen already, we call that a base paragraph. Now, after we've seen that base paragraph, if we see other paragraphs whose text exactly matches the base paragraph, we call that an exact match, as the name indicates. Okay. Besides exact matches, we have close matches, and this is where the analysis helps, because we find paragraphs that aren't exactly the same as a paragraph, but more likely than not came from the same original source paragraph. That's our belief. So now, if the general rules we use, and again, these are configurable at some level, is that at least half of the text in a paragraph has to match what's in the base paragraph, and less than 10 words of difference between two paragraphs. Then we call that a close match. I did want to add that this service, we're not doing a semantic analysis. Sometimes people ask me, can I find paragraphs in different documentation sets that are talking about the same subject but in different ways? That's not the intent here. We're trying to find paragraphs that diverged over time, that started as the same source, somebody cut it in, or somebody started with it and just started making it over, which happens often in a lot of different environments, but then got changed over time, and maybe got changed in different ways, sometimes for reasons that have to happen, sometimes reasons they didn't have to happen. Okay, so we're not doing a semantic analysis, and that's important. Okay. So we talked about we mentioned before, you send us your documents and we send you back a report. And here's a screenshot of what the summary report looks like. In a couple of minutes, we'll go into more detail and look at some examples of that. But let's take a look at the summary report. Okay, it tells you that we found, of this documentation set, we found 1070 paragraphs. And I should note that this is a documentation set that's a company that produces the consumer pumps that you put in the ground to keep water out of your basements and that sort of thing. So they tend to have a whole bunch of commonality, because the pump manuals aren't that different from each other. In this particular case, we found across the set 1,070 paragraphs, of which 287 were unique. Unique means that there were 287 paragraphs that we only found one occurrence of that paragraph. Didn't find anything close to that occurrence of the paragraph throughout the documentation set. Okay, and then the rest of the paragraphs, what we call non-unique, we mentioned before, the base paragraph is the first time we see a paragraph that has other things that are similar to it. There were 239 base paragraphs, and of those 239, there were 288 exact matches. So you can see that even the exact matches, a really high number here. The same exact paragraph exists across lots of documents. Now, the close matches, and again, we said before, these are things that are close enough that we believe that they may have come from the same source. There were another 256. Okay, so now you'll see we list the necessary paragraphs as 287, the unique, plus the 239 base paragraphs. And that means that's the minimum size your documentation set would possibly be if you squeezed everything you possibly could have out of a content reuse run through your documentation set. Potentially reusable paragraphs here was just about half, 544 paragraphs, meaning we use the word potentially reusable because two paragraphs may actually be using very simple phrasing, but be talking about two different things. One may be talking about inserting a memory card in a digital camera. Another one may be talking about removing the memory card in the digital camera. And they might be close matches, but not something that's easily set up to do reuse on, although if you become clever, you might be able to do it. And on the right here, you see a pie chart of essentially, this is, on the left here, showing you how big your documentation set would be in minimum and what's the potential for shrinking stuff. And we found that companies like this it helps if you're considering, let's say, going to an XML and you're not there already. It helps a little bit with what they call the ROI, your potential return on investment, to figure out, well, how much reuse is there in my documentation? If the number's high, it sometimes means you're a better candidate to switch over to XML. That's one of the things that may help. You'll get some more benefit out of that sort of thing. Okay, so this is what the summary report looks like. And now we're just going to show you some summary reports from some content reuse analysis we've run over the years from different industry profiles. Okay, so I'm going to run through these quickly. This is a company, that's telling you who the companies are, a company in transportation, e-commerce, and business. And here you can see it was a medium-sized documentation set with 5,000 paragraphs in it, and the reuse, which is over here, was potentially reusable paragraphs, which again just about half, 52%, potentially reusable. Wireless communication technology company, again, 48%. You can see that in the pie chart on the right here. An aircraft manufacturer, and the aircraft manufacturers tend to be quite high in terms of the reuse, partially because they often have different slightly variants of the same aircraft with modifications for, if it's for commercial, it might be for different airlines. They have slight modifications, but obviously how you fix the television in front of the seat is probably going to be the same in all of them. And if it's for military type environment, or maybe for different countries where they want different modifications to the aircraft, and so you end up with manuals that represent each of them, but when you bring them all together, there's a ton of potential reusable paragraphs. In this case, it was a very large documentation set, almost 60,000 paragraphs, and the potential reuse was almost 65%. You can see the pie chart over here on the right showing you that well more than half of it was potentially reusable. Medical device manufacturer, pretty typical, running about over 11,000 paragraphs, for about a third potentially reusable. And obviously it depends on whether the documentation that you're submitting is various versions of very similar devices or very different devices. Data storage systems, about a third reuse. Company in the media and broadcast industry, this was only 25%. Pharmaceutical company was running about 25%. This is on a fairly small documentation set where it was just a few different, I think, medications. But even there tends to be, reuse, because the same language gets used in the world of pharmaceutical world. Okay, so there's just some numbers to give you an idea of the kinds of industries you can expect to find reuse in documentation sets. Okay, so quickly, when should we be doing a content reuse analysis? So anytime you believe you have significant redundant data, it's a good idea to consider. We mentioned before about cleaning up and finding errors, and that sort of effort is always useful. Removing inconsistencies is also a good idea, and certainly if you're converting to XML, and if you're planning on going to DITA or S1000D, it's a good idea to do it. One of the age-old questions is, if I'm moving my documentation over to structured markup language, should I do the reuse first and then convert, or should I convert and then do the reuse? Obviously, if you do the reuse first, you'll have less to convert. It's a little bit more of a challenge because there's now two sets of things that are changing. I'm going to a different paradigm, and I'm cleaning things up. So ultimately, it becomes a question of what's practical for your environment. But if you can do it beforehand, before you move over, that's something. Okay, so now we mentioned the content reuse analysis, and now we're going to look through some examples of what the report looks like. Okay, so here's the first example I brought the slide up for, which was the summary report, which we looked at before, which showed 1070 paragraphs. This is the company that makes pumps, and we actually look at the reuse report. Let's just take a look at like an example so we know what we're talking about over here. Taking a look here, you can see here, this is is the PDF of a manual that we converted. Fairly typical technical manual for a pump. You'll see here on the second page, focus a little bit about the second page, which has stuff on the safety alerts and that sort of thing. When we switch to another manual, okay, you'll see the first page looks different, but this information at the beginning here on the safety information typically looks the same. There's some variation to it, right? If you look at the first one, it says, when you see the symbol, be alert to the potential for personal injury with a period. The second one has the same words, but potential for personal injury with an exclamation point. And the third one has the same thing, only it says this is a safety alert without the safety alert symbol. Okay, and it also, instead of having the word injury, right, the first one had the word injury with a period, the second one had the word injury with an exclamation point, and the third one had it with a colon. Okay, so now in the switching back to this report over here, the summary report, there's a link to the detailed report, and the main part of the detailed report is this paragraphs matches. So I'm going to click on that and pull up this the detailed report. Okay? So now a quick introduction on how you read this report, which is that you'll see each paragraph is separated by a line that goes underneath this one to the next. Inside of each of these, you'll see a bunch of text in bold. That's what we call the base version of the paragraph. So typically it's the first version of that paragraph that we saw. That's what's in bold. The one right below it, the one that has this red and blue mixed in, is what we call a harmonized view. It tries to show all the variations we found of that paragraph. Okay, and then and you'll see here that what's in blue is what was in the base. So in this particular case, it said safety alert symbol, which is what's right above it. And what's in red in the curly braces is all the different fragments that are variations from that base text. In this particular case, it had safety dash alert, okay, instead of just safety space alert. Okay, and then down at the end here, there were a few different variations of, I think we showed you before inside of the PDF, this, here's a version here with injury colon in this S280 over here. So that first one is this document right over here. So we give you the name of each document and then all variations. So so after the first version of the paragraph is in bold. The second one is the harmonized view, and then beyond that, we show you each variation from the base paragraph, and then essentially what you would have to do to get from the base paragraph to this other version. And it's done in a way that most people are familiar with. If you use Microsoft Word and you do revision tracking or do a difference between documents, that's how it shows it to you. The strike-through is if I got rid of this and changed that, I get to this version. So it's telling you that from the base version of this paragraph, which was in this 23P6310 manual, to get to the version that's in, here's 1, 2, 3 exact matches that are listed here. I'm sorry, not exact matches. There weren't any exact matches to the base. To get from the base version of the paragraph to this one slight variant here, which is in S502, 506, and 509, you would have to essentially just take what's in the base and replace the word injury period with injury colon. And you can see that here. Here was the base one at injury period, and the other injury colon, injury exclamation point. And it points out that, we say, try to clean up inconsistencies. Well, somebody decided that the exclamation point is important. It may be that you'd really want to put it in all of them. Okay, and then as we go down, you'll see there's another variation which just had safety dash alert. Again, not a big change. An injury was with a colon instead of a period, and then down below is just the injury here. But you can see all of these, there were really 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 versions of this paragraph. And if you look at it, this one is a good example of one where probably all saying the same thing. The word symbol was left out in some of them, right? So some versions said just this is the safety alert without the word symbol, right? Which is just to bring back up, this manual over here. It said this is a safety alert. They meant to say this symbol is the safety alert symbol, so that word is probably useful to have there. go about and try to clean this up in some way and make it all consistent, then it'll make content reuse easier, but it'll also reduce the inconsistencies in your language. Okay, the next paragraph is really talking about the second paragraph inside of this manual, going back to the PDF of the manuals. You can see there are 3 paragraphs in a row that actually the wording is almost exactly the same, but defining the difference between danger, warning, and caution says one will warn about hazards that will cause, one can cause, or one will or can cause personal minor injury. And these are not necessarily paragraphs that you could bring all together into one in this particular case, but you can see in the content reuse analysis the wording was similar in all of them, so that it shows all the variations as will or can cause serious or minor personal injury, death, or major property damage. And then it shows you all the variations. In this particular case, from the version that was in 253 P6310, there are a whole bunch, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 that are exact matches to the version in the base, and then a whole bunch of others that are just slight variations. Well, this one says will or can. And this is an example again of one that you wouldn't necessarily want to do content reuse on, but it's useful to see if there's any variation in the language. Okay, this next one, just showing you a variation of, sometimes it said the label notice indicates special instructions, sometimes it said the word notice indicates special instructions. Again, probably not a significant difference. It's something that could be cleaned up to bring them all together. The next one below it is just a variation. Sometimes it said to read safety instructions in this manual and on pump, or some said or on pump. And it's a good example of, it might be that you need something of a subject matter expert who knows a little bit about the product. You can't just read this and say, oh, it should just say and on pump, because there may be no safety instructions on the pump, so they may want it in certain cases to say or on pump, in certain cases to say and on pump. Okay, a couple more quick examples inside of this manual. Here's just one of showing you, this is a company that has a few different corporate names that they use for some of their products. And so you can see here in this, here's the base version, which says stay right's only duty is to repair. And then you see in the harmonized view here with the blue and the red, all the variations from the base version of the paragraph. So there's stay right, Pentair Water, stay right Industries, Pentair's. And then all the variations there. This is an example of, if you remember what we talked about at the, earlier on about content reuse inside of DITA. If you're using DITA, you can set up a variable to represent this information, and then the rest of the text in these paragraphs doesn't really change, so you can have one phrase in all these places and shrink it all down, so you can shrink the size of your documentation. Okay, here's one we talk about where the language is slightly different. I'm talking about this guy over here, do not touch an operating motor. One version said modern motors are designed to operate at high temperatures. Another one says can operate at higher temperatures. Okay, and if you decide that one of these languages is more precise than the other, it's a good idea to clean them all up. Okay, another example here. This one, the only difference between the two is one was a item 15, and this guy over here was only number 15 and number 6 is an example of something that if you went to a full markup language, most of the time that kind of thing would fall out because the numbering would be auto-generated. It wouldn't come into play within this stuff here. And just lastly, to run through, just to show you some stuff that really has nothing to do with these pump manuals, but some examples that we sort of stuck at the bottom here to show you stuff pulled out from other types of manuals. Just looking at the last entry over here. Now this is some stuff pulled out of a manual that we can't show you, but changed the wording to be able to have something that we can show you, which is, you see at this last thing here, if you have a spelling error, for instance, it can show up sometimes pretty quickly. You know, the immediately was misspelled over here. You know, here is one again that you wouldn't really, you could do content reuse on if you had a variable that said has the number of pages. This is talking about front matter of a repair manual. It says how many pages are here, and each manual can say how many pages exist in the manual. Okay, I did want to mention that aside from the paragraph report, you get a sequence report. Okay, and what that means is, a sequence report means is when we find a paragraph that matches a another paragraph. When matches means it's an exact match or a close match. We're looking for paragraphs that are close matches or exact matches. If we find one that happens that way, then we look at the next paragraph. If it's a close or an exact match, we keep looking. We're trying to find sequences of paragraphs because these things may help you define sections of your manuals that can be broken down into smaller pieces, topics and data or something else like that, but even letting you know that the potential is really there. This particular case is telling you that in this manual, BE313, we found 15 paragraphs that seem to run in sequence with B745 and S367. We give you thumbnails of the beginning of each of the paragraphs. And that's useful information, letting you know at a higher level than the paragraph level are there sequences of stuff, and here you can see there's quite a bit of that. Just want to quickly run through a couple of other environments. This is for a company that makes telecommunications equipment, okay, and you can see 7,438 paragraphs were analyzed. The potential reuse was 54%, just to show you what the report looked like, something like that. And here you can see some reuse on this first paragraph is some slightly variance on the same language. I can't tell just from looking here whether it could all be cleaned up into one, but one version says carefully unpack and verify the contents of each XLR Pro kit. The other one said of just your kit. And says, sometimes it says the following items. Could be things that one could really clean up. Just to run through a couple of examples. Within this manual that I just want to highlight. Okay, just a typical, some wording that's slightly different here. Just this one I'm looking at for proper kit configuration. It was an operation, just the word operation with this one had a comma, this one didn't have a comma. It might be grammatically, you should have a comma there or not, but it gives you the opportunity to look at that. This is some slight variance of the version number within the software. Other than that, the paragraph is basically the same, but one version saw the need to put the word install, that USB drives will need to be on each computer, and the other one specifically telling you to install it. So you have some more information, you can decide about cleaning stuff up. This next example is one that talked about finding things that you might find out that you want to do a certain way. There's just two versions of this text of this paragraph. Sometimes it talked about DigiMesh. The other time it talked about DigiMesh with a trademark indication. And it may be that DigiMesh is something that always should be referred to with the trademark in front of it, and gives you the option to go clean stuff up, even not from a perspective of specifically speaking doing content reuse, but to make the stuff more consistent. Just an example of something we want to highlight. Here's another example of something where the language is slightly different. One says you can easily build networks. The other version, this one I'm talking about here, the other one says easily build networks up to. So the only big difference here is that one has 128 nodes and the other has 32 nodes. It could be that if you wanted to make this reusable, it might have a variable that says how many nodes are involved. Pull that in from someplace, and then the rest of it looks like language that's just somewhat inconsistent. Larger networks, one version just said, in the base version it said for larger networks up to this base version, and the one down below would just say of up to. They added the word, okay, which, just cleaning up the grammar. And one version here had RF optimization services uppercase and one in lowercase. Again, gives you the opportunity to, if one version is more correct than the other, for doing that kind of things. Now here's a warning, and you would hope that warnings would use consistent language because these are important. This one over here for applications that need, there's some variation here. One version said never leave unconnected inputs floating. The other one said should never be left floating. Okay, so it could be that these should really be cleaned up and made consistent. Okay. Lastly, there's a couple of commands here where they're talking about commands that are happening inside of something, and they're obviously you can see the harmonized view that shows some of it was done with quotes around it and some not. If you look where it says here, down below here, the A command, without the quotes, what's in the base paragraph just says the A command provides the version. guess it looks a little bit less clear without the quotes around it. The same thing for the T command and the F command. So you see this, you theoretically allows you to clean it up, but once you clean it up, you'll also have more potential reusability because you won't have two variations between this version and this version down below. Okay, and last one example from this one is one where different names, slight variance on the product name, and one of them has a registered trademark and the other one doesn't have the registered trademark. So again, an opportunity to make it more consistent, but also something like stuff we mentioned before, where in something like data, you could set up a variable and just fill in the names. So one might be XB and one might be XB Pro sort of thing. Okay, that's it for this one. And then just lastly, to just point out to you that we did a content reuse on some financial prospectuses, not the kind of stuff you'd normally think about in those things, but they tend to use the same language. You get some interesting results when you pull this stuff in. So you can see here the general language at the beginning. It's showing you all the names of the prospectuses here. This first thing here, the names of the prospectuses. Down below is somewhat of the extreme end of showing reuse because there's different ticker names for the names of the prospectuses. But if we just quickly look for, it can show you an example when you pull in information on, here's a couple paragraphs just talking about what the fund's portfolio turnover rate was. You can see, it's useful information because you can see quickly the different variations of the fund turnover rate. But here's an example of a paragraph that exists in a lot of these prospectuses. You can see that here, the list of occurrences. There are there's some variations to it. Sometimes it talks about the fund, it talks about our funds, investment advisors. I don't know whether a sub-advisor applies to all of them or not, but you can certainly use this kind of thing to check the language inside of these things and make sure they're as consistent or using the best possible version of the language. At cases where lawyers have run this on contracts to see differences between 10 different contracts that are all written around the same thing. I think that's all we have time for right now. So let me just switch back to the PowerPoint. Okay, and let me just, I think that's it, Adam. And I guess we do have time for a couple of questions. So are there any questions?
Well, thank you, Mike. A very informative webinar indeed. The first question that has come in is, so would the proposed workflow here be creating a separate document with all of the base paragraphs and sourcing the content into different variations of the document?
Okay, thank you for that question. So the thing is here that everybody's environments are different, and we're not necessarily proposing a workflow. We're just trying to give you, excuse me, we're trying to give you information. Now, hold on one second. I'm just going to take some water because my throat is dry. We're trying to give you information to allow you to try to make a first stab at this stuff. The information in the content reuse detailed report allows you to go out to your documents and go clean things up. So one of it might be that you would actually go out to your documents, make them all consistent, and then when that happens, if you bring them together, a lot of the component content management systems, if they find, if you bring something in that's an exact match to something else, they'll make note of that and won't bring it in again, and we'll just point them all at the same place. Your own particular solution, you don't even know what your workflow is. It might be that you have documents in a document management system and you're storing documents in Word or in Frame or in Adobe InDesign. You'll make changes to the documents. So we're not necessarily telling you what we would propose for a workflow. The more you can get your documents to be consistent, the more chance you have that you can break them up into pieces and point them all at the same location. So it's more a suggestion about how you can go find these changes and figure out how to clean them up more than telling you how to actually implement your own particular content reuse, which would be its own discussion, very long discussion on its own right, and not the point of this discussion. Next question.
Great. Thank you, Mike. The next question that's come in is, can I supply PDF files to Harmonizer?
Okay, so I mentioned earlier that you can actually supply documents to Harmonizer in a bunch of different formats. We talked about I think we talked about the fact that documents, maybe in most desktop publishing formats, word processing, and structured file formats, but largely because those are document formats telling you what's in your documents. PDF happens to be, although it's obviously it's everywhere, it isn't really a document format, it's a page layout format. And there are techniques that are used to turn that into a document format, but on complicated documents it's more challenging, multiple column layouts and that sort of thing. Sometimes you're not even sure the text is flowing from one document, from one paragraph, one column to another. So the short answer is that sometimes we can make use of the PDF documents as is because the process that takes those and turns them into documents. We need documents where we, for instance, know where paragraphs begin and end, which aren't necessarily indicated inside of a PDF. You don't necessarily know this is the end of a paragraph and the beginning of the next one. You try to guess at it. So where the documents are structured in such a way that will work, you could use PDF versions of documents. The worst case scenario is that the PDF documents have to go through a manual process, a cleanup process, before it's useful to take those into a content reuse analysis.
Great, thank you, Mike. The next question is, can I get a reuse analysis if my documents are not in English?
Right, so the answer to that is that as I mentioned before, the reuse analysis is not a semantic analysis. It's just looking for words and doesn't necessarily care about what language those words are in. But it does expect things that there be spaces, the typical types of spaces that exist with typical languages. So the standard answer is that certainly with languages that are Latin-based, those based off Latin key sets like French, Italian, Spanish, German, those should all be fine. The CJK, Korean, Japanese, Chinese type documents not. It won't work in its current instantiation like this. Other languages may or may not work. We've done it on most of the Latin-based languages and it's been fine. The others, we have to try it if you have some samples of something to try. Okay, next question.
Great, thank you, Mike. The last question that has come in is, do all the documents submitted for analysis have to be in the same source format?
Right. So the answer is that they don't. We can take your documentation set. You can give us different publishing formats, different word processing formats, HTML of documents. We'll bring them all together. Sometimes if there's inconsistencies how stuff is done within the one, we may find some differences that aren't real differences, small textual differences. But we certainly have the ability to process documentation sets that come in different publishing and structured markup formats. I think that's it for that question.
Great. Well, thank you, Mike. That was the last question, and thank you, everyone, for attending today's webinar. This concludes today's broadcast. You will be able to access the recorded version of this webinar in the webinar archive section of our website, located at www.dclab.com. Also, our next webinar will be August 16th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, titled Reality Check: What to Expect from an Automated Conversion to NLM JATS Bits XML, being presented by Beth Friedman, Senior Project Manager at DCL. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and have a great day.